Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 10.2, explain how new technologies shape attraction and social connections for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this part of the chapter, what your authors are really trying to do is to show you the way in which situational variables, like the advent of new technologies, may intersect with what we already know about how relationships form. So everything that you learned in the first two videos for this chapter about similarity and propinquity and familiarity and so on, all of those things are still going to play out in virtual environments, but they may be different in some ways. We also need to think about what are some ways that technologies like cell phones, computers, even AI, can influence the way we feel about relationships, can influence the success of relationships, and so on. Most of the research so far has dealt with things like smartphones, tablets, devices that we can use apps on to communicate with one another, or that we can text message or direct message people through. Smartphones definitely have had a massive impact on our lives, have changed the way we function in our everyday experiences. So it's reasonable for researchers to ask questions about the impact of technologies like smartphones on attraction. And, doing this kind of research is tricky in some respects, but we have found that experiments have shown, and these are, laboratory-based experiments with high degrees of experimental control. Experimenters have found that there is a causal link between having a mobile device in your hand and decreased evidence of social connections. And that's both in terms of perceived social connection, like how close you feel to another person, how understood you feel by them, but also actual indicators of social connection. Things like the degree to which you like another person, that you feel that you know the other person, and so on. Just the mere presence of a phone, even if it isn't yours, just sitting on a table, can also influence the nature of your interactions. I've noticed this definitely in classes when I teach in person. Most of the time now, in comparison to the time period before we had phones and laptops at our disposal where we could be online constantly, now just the presence of those devices means that people's attention is going to be divided. Their attention will shift back and forth between their devices and the people in the room, including, the instructor of a classroom. Now, move that to a context like you're out on a date with your partner. The mere presence of the phone on the table is like entertaining another person or multiple people at the same time as you're on a date with another person. Or if you're with your friends, I've lost count of the number of times I myself have done this, but I've lost count of the number of times I've sat in a social group and everybody was on their phone instead of talking to one another. And it's not like I'm anti-phone. I love my phone and I use it constantly, and I feel a sense of anxiety when I can't find it. So I am not anti-phone. What we know, though, from psychological research is that when our attention is divided, it creates difficulty for us in focusing our attention on the person we are communicating with, and vice versa. When we are waiting for a text message, waiting for an update, even just looking at the time, it takes our attention away from the person that we're sitting with. There's even, a slang term for this experience. It's called being phubbed or phone snubbed. And when you ask people, their impressions of a first encounter with another individual, if that person is using their phone, or even if their phone is just sitting with them, they tend to be perceived as less interested in you, and therefore they tend to be downgraded in terms of their attractiveness. So I suppose one message from this research is, if you want someone to believe that you're fully paying attention to them, put the phone away, and then you will have your attention undivided, and they will be able to look at you, talk to you, listen to you, and vice versa. Now, some research, and this is research that's still catching up, while we have had now a couple of solid decades worth of online dating and the emergence of multiple forms of dating apps that we now use on our phones, research is still catching up in terms of what does this mean for what people prefer in terms of their ideal partners. Now, similarity continues to be the driver. So even when people are looking for a potential partner online, they are tending to want to find intersections with their own beliefs, attitudes, values, interests, and so on. And also, looking for similarity of goals. Now, all of this is most of the research is about looking for a partner, not necessarily about looking for a hookup or looking for someone just to have fun with. Some research has looked at that as well, but it is a real mixed bag in terms of the results. It very much depends on what kind of relationship people are looking for. Some recent research argues that, or it has found that we do have a tendency to look for comparable people. So just like I talked about in the one of the Learning Objective 10.1 videos, we also typically try to screen who we're looking at online so that they're kind of in our ballpark. We can see them as a legitimate person that we have a chance with, for want of a better way to put it. So just like has been found in-person studies, we tend to really focus our attention on people who are within our level of attractiveness and then select within that pool. People do tend to move in the direction of, and then also to be preferred by, others who are similar in level of popularity. And this has actually been found in some of the dating apps that actually show how often people are matched. So, I've never used one of these dating apps. Thankfully, I'm married and I never have to date again, I hope. But some of the dating apps apparently will kind of rank people. They'll give them a score that shows the degree to which they are attractive to other people. So, how often have they been viewed? How often have they been matched up? And what people will try to do is, let's say, since I've never been on these apps, I don't know what they really look like. Let's say that you have a 5-star match possible. You're going to say, hey, I'm only a 3. I'm not going to waste my time on a 5. So you go for other 3s, or maybe an aspirational 4 on a scale from 1 to 5. If you're a 5, you're going to go for the other 5s, right? And there's some research that shows that that's true. No difference between males and females. And, like most of the research, let me add the asterisks here, the vast majority of this research has looked at heterosexual men and women, and has not looked at other kinds of relationships. So, keep that in the back of your mind. That's one of the major limitations of research in this area. Now, some of the early research in this space has looked at dating websites. So originally, we didn't have all these kind of apps on phones. Originally, it was all just on computers. So the internet happened, cell phones happened later. So in some of the research, they were looking at dating websites that use algorithms to decide who's a good fit for whom. So many of the early investigations looked at these big websites that aggregate lots and lots of profiles. And your job as the person who wants to find a date is to look through all these profiles. So what they do for you is they have you fill out a bunch of questionnaires about who you are. And then the algorithm, what it's supposed to do is find you people who have similar profiles to you, and then offer those to you as potential matches. This gives you an opportunity to have multiple communications with potential other people, which is an upside. It can also be very overwhelming for some people. The goal is to match users based on compatibility. Match.com was one of the originals in this space, or eHarmony is another one. And their advertising was really driven by this idea that they could use science, and computer science in particular, to use your personality profile to find you the perfect match. Now, research in this space has been mixed at best in terms of showing that websites like this can actually do a great job or a better job than people dating in the wild at finding you the perfect match. It's really not that much better. Some people find it really helpful, though, because, we tend to have more fast-paced lives, difficulty finding people. We may, spend hours and hours and hours of our lives at work and not have much time to go out and go to places where people used to meet up and find mates. We also move a lot more. So our connection to various communities and our connections to things like church communities, school communities, and so on tend to be looser than they did in the past. So for many people who struggle to identify potential partners because of their mobility, because of their looser attachments to community, may find dating websites to be super helpful. The downsides are the algorithms overpromise and underdeliver. So, buyer beware as you're looking at these kinds of technologies. There are lots of downsides to online dating. You don't have to be a true crime fan to know that there are some definite risks, but let's put that on the back burner for the moment. The idea that computer-driven mathematical algorithms can really push you toward an ideal mate, there's just not much data that supports that. The mystery of what it means to fall in love is still a mystery that your best, most powerful computer can't solve. So we don't have a lot of empirical support that the type of screening that they're using, the questionnaires that they have people fill out, are actually all that useful for helping people to find partners. So the success rate of dates that are engineered this way don't tend to be any more successful. And by success, what they mean is you have a date, and then you have more dates, and then eventually you have a committed relationship. So if the goal is committed relationship, online dating is no better and no worse than old-fashioned dating, like meeting someone through work, or meeting someone through hobbies, or through church, or through just various other kinds of community connections. There's also the problem that sometimes online profiles are just filled with lies, and that can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction, and eventually it can lead people to just stop using them. So one particular study that your authors report in your textbook showed that about 81% of participants had provided false information related to at least one trait that they have. Most often people are manipulating things like age, making themselves seem younger, their weight, making themselves seem slimmer, their height, making themselves either taller or in some cases shorter. But people, regardless of sex, tend to lie about these things with a fair amount of frequency. And that should give you pause. If individuals are going to lie about things like that, might they not lie about other things? And in fact, some research has shown that to be the case as well. Now, one study, Thoma and Hancock, and your authors talk about this as well. They wanted to kind of find out what are some cues, some clues in dating profiles that have false information. What are some clues that what you're seeing isn't actually reliable? What they found was that profiles that included deceptive information tended to include other hints and clues that are associated with lying. Like the profile tends to include fewer personal references like I and me. I like to go hiking. And instead makes things more externalized. Instead of referencing themselves in first person, to refer to themselves in third person, or just to talk about activities that are fun instead of talking about themselves enjoying the activity. Second, deceptive profiles tend to use more negative language. So, as your authors put it, negations. So they would say, I'm not judgmental, instead of saying they're open to new experiences. They might say they don't mind taking risks, instead of using a single word and saying adventurous. So that's a clue that may indicate deceptiveness. Finally, deceptive profiles tend to use fewer total words. Now, this research was done in 2012. I am really, really interested to see what's happening right now, because there's been some rumbling out in the world that people are using tools like ChatGPT to write their dating profiles for them. So you can go on to ChatGPT. I encourage you, it can be hilarious to have ChatGPT write you a dating profile. So you go on there and you can give it a few key pieces of information. And some of that information may actually be true. And then have ChatGPT write a profile for you. So the rumors are that a lot of people are starting to do this on their dating apps and just have ChatGPT concoct something that sounds attractive. There's also some initial findings that people are having ChatGPT morph their pictures. So modify their pictures to make them more attractive. Like, it's not hard to have a computer modify a picture of your face so that it is slightly more symmetrical, so that you look less old, and generally more attractive than you do in real life. One of the research topics in recent years that has been interesting to many social psychologists, as well as, I also teach a course in human sexual behavior. There's this idea of hookup culture. And I remember about 10 years ago, there was this big splash of news that college students, that young people today, all they're doing is hooking up. So, the idea was that young people were just going out, finding a potential sex partner, having sex with them, and never seeing them again. And the idea was that you have to be engaging in all these hookups, meaningless sexual encounters just for fun. What recent research shows, though, is that that's more of a myth than a reality. On college campuses today, and this is research that's been conducted over the past decade or so, what you find is that there's a relatively small percentage of students who appear to engage in a lot of seeking out casual sexual encounters. And they may even, talk about it a lot with their friends. For the majority of college students, however, they are not doing that. So we don't see, in comparison to other generations in the past, we don't see any higher rates of casual sex now than we did in the past. Part of what's going on is that this phrase hookup, which in my generation that used to be called a one-night stand, or just the more generic term casual sex, it means different things to different people. Some people look at a hookup as a purely entertainment-driven desire to have sex with another person. So you go out, you find one, you do the deed, and you go home. For other people, a hookup means you know someone, you see them around, you kind of like them, so you hook up now and then. That's a completely different thing. So sometimes people are using the same term to mean very different experiences. When we look at just the general findings right now, people who have one-time sex with someone they don't really know, and it's a one-off, it's a relatively small percentage. So if you're walking around your college campus thinking everybody's hooking up and I'm not, don't feel like you're missing out, because the vast majority of other college students are not doing that. And as I said before, the amount of casual sex without commitment, in other words, has not increased. The stereotypes suggest that, say, your generation and the one just prior to yours has been having all kinds of casual sex, and, immorality has just grown exponentially. It hasn't. Your behavior really isn't all that different than previous generations. You're using different language, perhaps, to describe it, and you're perhaps less judgmental about it, but the actual amount of it isn't changing. So researchers are very skeptical. People out in popular culture, they think hooking up is a thing among younger people today, but the research just does not bear that out. In general, what research shows, young people today are not that different from past generations. And in some studies in the last 5 years, so since COVID, for young people right now, they're actually having less sex and being far more selective about who they have sex with than those in some previous generations. Now, some researchers are tying that directly to the pandemic. Others are tying it to other kinds of transformations that we are undergoing as a culture right now. But it is interesting how the stereotype simply does not reflect the reality. That concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 10.2.